I'm Samantha Engel.
And I'm Aaron Gullius, and this is Great Lakes Lore. Hey, Samantha, how are you?
I'm okay. My voice is a little shot today. My throat's a little sore. I had 2 senior citizen tours I had to give at work today, big group tours. So
wow,
it was a busy day.
Did anybody wander off?
You know, there's always one person who's going to ask you every question about 3 points before you're going to actually explain the thing. And so I had that lady, but I'm also able to like wrangle them in a funny way. So like when I realized this is what she was doing, we got upstairs to one room and she wandered off the other way. I was like, hey, now get back here. We're going to go there next. And like everybody laughed about it. She's like, I know. And came over. And then there's always like the one like kinder, well, of course, kind, older gentleman who always wants to stand right next to you because you're the young historian girl. And
that's my dad. That's my dad on these senior citizens tours. Absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, so he was like that when he was my age too. So, and I'm like that. So it's probably. It's probably genetic. And
yeah, no, they went really well. It was great. They're my first group tours that I've had since before COVID. So they went well. I was really happy with them. Not that you all need a rundown of my employment and my job, but that's where I'm at today. That's
great. I had a dead car battery that I needed to fix in the needle sharp wind that was blowing across Michigan today. And I've been answering repetitive questions about assignments that are due tomorrow.
Yay.
So, which is my job. But nobody tried to get ahead and go into a different room that I had to corral. So I guess things are okay. So today we're going to be looking at some ghosts. And ooh. I think, tell me if I'm wrong, Sam, this is the first actual sort of, let's look at some hauntings, sort of like haunted house type
stuff. I think so. Like here's a building history. Here are the claims that are inside of it. Now let's see if we can verify some of this stuff. I think it is the first one we've done.
Yeah, or see where the history matches up to what everybody says.
Yes,
that's
local legend
on haunted fill-in-the-blank-city.com.
Yes.
Things like that. So we're going to be looking at St. Paul, Minnesota. Have you ever been to the Twin Cities, Sam?
I have not.
Neither have I. I've been to Duluth. That's in Minnesota.
My friend Heather is a big fan
of the Twin Cities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to go there. They sound great. There's all sorts of wonderful things that come from there. My favorite thing ever, Mystery Science Theater 3000, is a Twin Cities creation, and they're all like Minnesota people, and they're the most Midwestern people ever, and it's wonderful. St. Paul has an interesting history, and we're going to be exploring some of that history today, along with some ghosts.
So the hauntings that we're going to be looking at specifically, or I guess these places, have a strong connection to the Prohibition era. And so for historical context, we thought we'd explain a little bit about Prohibition in case any of you out there don't know Prohibition. But we are also going to look a little bit more broadly about organized crime and maybe some misconceptions that we might have about that, because it's all going to tie into the ghost stories later.
Absolutely. So I need to warn everybody that the 1920s are one of my favorite things, and I am going to really restrain myself. I'm not even going to mention modernism, apart from explaining that I'm not going to.
Yeah, it's not relevant.
No, it's not. Isn't it, Sam? Really? So the phrase the Roaring Twenties conjures up a lot of stereotypical images: flapper dresses, jazz, baseball, movie stars, cars that look like works of art. But Prohibition is the one thing that sticks out for many people, sort of underlying this. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified by 46 out of the 48 states. It wasn't close or anything. And in 1920, the Volstead Act was passed, which was the enabling legislation for the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. And this ban would last until 1933, when the 21st Amendment would be ratified, which canceled out the 18th Amendment, and also gave the name to a chain of liquor stores in Indianapolis, 21st Amendment Liquors, which I always thought was the best name for a liquor store. But Prohibition doesn't come out of nowhere. Sometimes if you just sort of read about it, you think, oh, why on earth in 1919 did they decide to ban alcohol? Anti-alcohol activists have been calling for increased restrictions or outright bans on alcoholic beverages for decades, with the temperance movement being one of the leading social reform movements of the 19th century. During the progressive era of the early 20th century, the movement was one of several that gained momentum by being presented as a public health measure. So sort of along the same lines as we need better sewage and sanitation systems, and we need to get the rat hair out of our yogurt and all of these other things. We also need to get rid of whiskey. That's just, it's just a common sense thing. Leadership came from organizations like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and support had been building during the 1910s. State legislatures were placing more and more restrictions and regulations on alcohol production and sales. And one thing that benefited anti-alcohol activists was, in a way, World War I. Much of the beverage industry opposition, sort of the leadership of this, was led by breweries run by very German-sounding people. So at the head of I forget what the name of the organization was, but it was basically the big trade organization for the alcoholic beverage industry. It was dominated by breweries. So the leadership of people opposed to temperance were very sort of German. And so there was some rhetoric around 1917, 1918 about, hey, Prohibition is also kind of patriotic during wartime. So, which is something I read about when I was doing research for this that I hadn't really heard of before, but it makes as much sense as any of the other sort of rampant nationalism that was going on at the time.
Additionally, temperance had been on the minds of many throughout, especially the latter half of the 19th century, as, sort of an anti-immigration thing. There were lots of connections between alcoholism and just over drinking and things, and the new immigrants that were coming in, especially the Irish, and they also tied it in some cases, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, to women's rights as well. So as women, we can care for folks, and we don't want our husbands out drinking, and so give us the vote, and we'll get rid of alcohol as well. So there were so many reasons that had been building for half a century or more to ban alcohol. So
I'd put it at a century. I think you can take us back to the 1820s and say that especially the sort
with
of
Jackson and stuff.
The effect of alcoholism ruined families. It destroyed families, and that's it sounds like a sort of emotional argument, but no, it's given the amount of legal and economic power women had in the early to mid 19th century. If the man of the house was a ruinous drunkard, that's bad for everybody.
Yep. A lot of times I think we connect Prohibition with organized crime. And the popular narrative goes that once Prohibition came into effect, organized crime appeared to take advantage of the illegal trade in booze. We've all watched The Untouchables, right? That's seared into my eye. I loved The Untouchables. Oh, so good. But truly organized crime was already around, engaging in prostitution, gambling, and theft. Alcohol simply provided yet another investment for their portfolio, if you will. Opponents of Prohibition often touted a vast increase in violent crime due to black market alcohol distribution and sales, but modern historians, such as Kenneth D. Rose, argues that the notion of the Prohibition-induced crime wave, despite its popularity during the 1920s, cannot be substantiated with any accuracy because of the inadequacy of records kept by local police departments. So, organized crime was around. We don't know that it got bigger. It just took advantage of this thing that I think in today's society, we're like, oh, that's so crazy. They banned alcohol. And so we tie all these other things into it. Regardless of what the statistics might say, there was a public image of organized crime as being predominant during the decade. Criminal figures and organizations were, while not quite celebrities, certainly well known. John Dillinger, Al Capone, and others were never far from the headlines. The brutal glamour of organized crime during the 1920s has been a mainstay of pop culture in the United States ever since. And organized crime would obviously continue to be active in the United States and remain a fixture in television and film. So while we're going to be talking about some stories outside of what could strictly be called the Prohibition era, the era of Prohibition looms large over much of what we are going to discuss in terms of the overall context.
Yeah, so we're going to be going a little past it in a couple of cases, a little before it in a couple of cases, but this is a very prohibition-y sort of theme. If we would have limited it just to prohibition, we would have had to cut some cool stuff.
And it wouldn't be a complete picture of these places either. They didn't just crop up suddenly in 1920.
and one of the things we found, and this is going to come out, I think, sort of as a running theme through the episode, is that a lot of times there are ghost cases and stories that are sort of connected by sales pitches and promotional things and advertising to prohibition and organized crime because people like gangsters. Mm-hmm. So it's a way to hook these things together.
Did you see the movie? I forget what it's called. The Highwaymen? Is that what it's called? It's on Netflix. It is with Kevin Costner again and Woody Harrelson about them chasing Bonnie and Clyde in the 30s.
I have not seen. I've heard of it.
It's really good.
Is it good?
I've watched it a couple times. I'm a Woody Harrelson fan though, but I watched it a couple times. But in it, they really kind of highlight this newfound celebrity that criminals of the time had, how they captured the newspapers, how, spoiler, Bonnie and Clyde died. And so, how these young people were throwing themselves out as, they pulled the car through and were mourning the death of these criminals, and how Woody Harrelson and Kevin Costner, as being sort of these older Texas Rangers, they didn't get it and they were very disturbed by the whole thing. But it definitely ties into this idea of the outlaw celebrity for sure.
Yeah, there's a sort of attraction to it,
mm-hmm.
I think, and I think a lot of that. I'm going to stop talking about the 20s. I almost.
I know. Well, I brought up a new movie,
I know, but I almost went into my my growth of a nationalized mass media thing. So
that's totally part of it. Yeah.
I'll restrain myself. So we're going to be looking at two specific locations in St. Paul, Minnesota that have widely recognized sort of dark histories and some supernatural connections. And the first thing we're going to be looking at are the Wabasha Caves. Adrian Lee, a ghost hunter, in his book Mysterious Minnesota, Digging Up the Ghostly Past at 13 Haunted Sites, says of the Wabasha Caves, "The ghost of a murdered gangster is just one of the numerous dead souls that regularly attend the events and celebrations at the caves, uninvited and normally unnoticed."
If they're unnoticed, how do they know they're there?
Thank you. Thank you. I was like, okay, is she going to pick up on this? Because I'm going to. When I typed that in there, I was like, that doesn't make any sense at all. No, it doesn't. No. No sense at all, but it's fun. So the basic history of the cave. While some of the caves were natural, carved out of sandstone by the flow of the Mississippi River, they were greatly enlarged and new caves were being dug beginning in 1849. And if you're in the loop on sandstone, you can dig a cave in that like an afternoon, right? So beginning in 1849, these caves start to be dug out, and they were originally dug out to mine for silica used in glass making. Later, beginning in the 1880s, the cool, dark, damp environment of the caves made them ideal for mushroom growing, making this one small area of St. Paul that was dubbed Mushroom Valley one of the leading producers of mushrooms in the United States for a time, with more than 50 separate caves being used for growing fungus. So when I think of caves, I think of dark horror because I'm claustrophobic and I do not like them at all. But I remember sort of walking in caves on tours. These caves were huge. So the scale of the size, the largest one that was run by the Becker Sand and Mushroom Company. So you could do both things in the caves. Yeah. You could, I was going to say you could grow sand. You could mine sand and grow mushrooms. So this cave had a mile of passageways and 35-foot high ceilings. Mm. And it wasn't just mushrooms. The caves were also a very close match for caves in France used for aging Roquefort cheese. So some French people came over from France? and decided to age some cheese in these caves as well.
Yeah. So then during the era of Prohibition, however, another profitable enterprise made the caves useful. One of the mushroom growers was a man named Albert Mouchenot. perhaps, who had immigrated from France. During the 1920s, Mouchonats apparently believed that bootlegging was a better deal than mushroom growing and converted his cave into a restaurant and nightclub called the Wabasha Street Speakeasy. The property changed hands and reopened as the Castle Royal, a legitimate establishment, not a speakeasy, in October of 1933. Now, all of the accounts we found say things like Castle Royal was said to be frequented by known criminals like John Dillinger and Ma Barker, but it's local legend.
Yeah. Said who says? Everybody says that. Everybody knows.
The caves have also been home to debris that accumulates during heavy storms and floodings. Lots of junk gets swept up in the waters of the raging Mississippi, and the caves have been used to store this detritus. Could this be a source of paranormal activity in the area? Aaron?
Well, Adrian Lee believes it is because he suspects that some of those items have attached to them negative energies from the poor souls who once owned them.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that theory?
Maybe.
Why not?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a stretch. I don't really know why. It seems reaching. Like you're purposely trying to make the place seem haunted.
It does, doesn't it? And why would somebody wanting to sell a book about hauntings want to do that? No, I get cynical sometimes. Yeah, there are some ghost stories attached to this site, though.
Yeah, so I found a recording of a 2018 ghost tour on YouTube. They call them their Lost Souls tour. And so now the caves do have different owners from the folks who owned it in 2018, but they are still hosting something called Lost Souls Tour. So I'm not sure if it's, I can't speak to whether or not it's going to be exactly the same. But I thought I'd give you a rundown of what happened inside of this ghost tour because it was something.
Now, I want to ask, and this is a leading question because I know the answer. The tour guide, were they dressed in any sort of
I was going to talk
way?
About this.
I was hoping, but I wanted to sort of give you an entry there.
So the tour guide for this specific ghost tour was dressed as a French maid with a noose around her neck for some reason. And I also saw there were several things, I'm assuming filmed around Halloween time, right? Where the local news station visits the creepy place in town or whatever. They went in to meet their sort of tour guide to tell them a couple ghost stories. And this one was dressed as some kind of creepy nurse, and she introduced herself as Nurse Hatchet. So
Nurse Ratchet's less popular cousin.
All right, but on to this tour then. So the guide claimed that there were upwards of 30 ghosts in the caves. And the caves themselves, some areas that they took them to on the tours were finished, while others were unfinished. They look very cavey, if you will. And between a couple of the videos that I watched, they claimed that the bar was the most active area. There is still a bar there. They host wedding receptions and different parties and all kinds of things down there. You can rent the space. And so in this bar area, it's apparently super haunted. And there are reports of gangster ghosts all around, but particularly two that like to sit at the end of the bar. In a news report that I saw from the location, the guide told the reporters that a bartender was working alone and had been drinking a glass of wine. She then turned around, and when she turned back to her glass, it was filled back up. So a ghost helping her drink.
Sounds legit.
Yeah. Some of the most interesting stories revolve around the fireplace room, as the guide called it. And apparently in this room, 3 gangsters were gunned down, and you can still see the bullet holes around the fireplace. In all of the lore that we've seen about this location, they all say that the bodies are probably buried in the soft limestone under your feet in this space. The guide also shared the story of a young boy who was in the caves for a wedding in this bar area. He was the ring bearer, and the boy himself mentioned how much he liked talking to the old gangsters. And now, during these events, it does seem like they hire actors to come in and portray, a John Dillinger ghost, whoever other other gangster ghost. So there was somebody there doing that, and they would kind of lead little groups out into the caves to like see some of the spaces or whatever, probably to detract from people wandering on their own, I would think.
Yeah.
But the child was adamant that there were multiple gangsters all around. And during this tour, they stop a couple of times at different places, and they show like a slideshow of some photographs that were taken in the space. And they have a picture that was submitted by like the boy's parents or something of the boy, and there are 2 foggy spots around.
Ooh.
Foggy spots. Ooh. There were many pictures of orbs.
Orbs. That's something, isn't it?
And the guide said something like, I can't remember. I should have written this down. But she said something like, now, of course. Oh, and she had a terrible fake accent. I don't know what that was about. But she said something like, of course, people just say that the caves are dusty and you can see the dust, and that's all these are. But look at some of them are bright, and I don't know. It was foolish.
Yes,
and I just stopped listening.
How dust works with flash photography. Oh, orbs.
There's also some odd story about an archangel, and I don't know if this was explained in some part of the tour that like wasn't illicitly recorded by this tour participant, I'm assuming. But they said that there was a tour many years ago, and the chandelier fell, and glass like sprayed all over, but it was amazing that nobody was hurt. So maybe it was the archangel who was protecting everybody.
Why an archangel?
I don't know. I don't know.
Could any random cherubim or seraphim not done this?
It took Michael.
You don't. Yeah, right. You don't need the guy who like will defeat Lucifer at the last Trump to be doing this. I mean, my angelology hackles are raised by this.
I've watched enough Supernaturals. I know what I'm talking about. Then finally, there was another story involving a guide who believed she was visited by her recently deceased grandfather during the tour. Oh. So clearly, you do not have to have died in the cave in order to be there. Just, maybe it's somehow a place where the veil is more thin. I don't know. But all of these stories, frankly, in my opinion, as I was watching it, I was like, this could be an amazing historical tour. I could create an interpretive plan that would knock visitor socks off, but this is the lamest ghost tour I've ever seen.
It really does sound like it. And I've got to say that in all the sort of articles and books I looked through when we were working on this, there are, one of the story about the young boy who sees the gangster ghost at the wedding. That one is in, that one's a common one. And as we're going to see, the sort of gunned down gangster story is, but that story
didn't even have ghosts attached to it. Like in the tour, it was just talking about what happened there. Unless again, we didn't, all wasn't recorded. I don't know.
I think this is, and it's under new management now, so we're not casting aspersions on any prominent business in glorious St. Paul, Minnesota. I get the feeling this was a lousy tour in some ways, because there's a bit more to the murdered gangster story than the Lost Souls tour gives us. Now, according to local legend, related in a number of books about Twin Cities area hauntings, the gangsters were playing cards when a man with a case came in and asked everyone to leave except for the gangsters, then himself, so he was still there, and a waitress. The waitress went to the kitchen and then heard gunshots. She comes back out. 3 of the gangsters are dead. And the 4th, who apparently had set the whole thing up to get them in this place, left with the gunman. So those 3 gangsters had been betrayed. The waitress calls the police, and the police show up. They usher her out. They investigate the crime scene. And then they bring her back and say they see no evidence of a crime. They've cleaned everything up. And they accuse her of filing a false police report despite the bullet holes that are in the fireplace being proof of the shooting. Adrian Lee, in his book Mysterious Minnesota, recounted a number of investigations he conducted with his ghost hunting group in this area. And the first edition of the book came out in 2007, which is interesting because that predates all of the web articles summarizing these stories that we were able to find. So it's a useful source. And I suspect it was kind of the source for a lot of the October stories that roll around from various Twin Cities news blog sites that talk about these things.
Yeah, very similar to like the Mackinac Island one, right? Where that one guy had written the book and he put the tour together. And so those are then the stories that just roll around everything.
It just becomes the sort of
canon.
Text.
It becomes canon.
It's canon. It's canon. Yeah, it's absolutely canon. Do not try to tell a non-canon ghost story. You will be drummed out of the magic circle. So Lee detailed an investigation his group did of the room where the gangster murder took place. And there were a number of orbs in the video, but Lee is sensible enough to explain this as water vapor. It's a damp cave. There's dust. There's, gunk in the air that's going to show up. Now, multiple spirits were supposedly willing to respond to questions. Also interesting is the fact that team member Steve R. saw the shadow of a figure bending down, quote, perhaps bent over in pain from a gunshot.
Maybe it's tying a shoe.
I think that is just as sensible an explanation. But do we have documentation and lore that there was a shoe that was untied? No, but we know the story of the gunned down gangsters. So they're willing to answer questions. And they had a ghost device with them called an Ovilus, which is a brand of a very expensive ghost hunting piece of equipment and controversial from what I've seen. So an Ovilus is a tool that detects changes in temperature and electromagnetic fields. And Lee states in the glossary of his book, it is believed, by whom? It is believed that an entity with practice can facilitate ambient environmental changes to choose the words it requires to communicate. An Ovilus operates a computer that has a lexicon of words and phonetics programmed into it. So the ghosts are learning how to talk. I don't know, with practice, it says. How do they learn this? Do they learn this from other ghosts?
I don't know. It seems like you'd have to have folks in there using it quite a bit in order for them to figure out how it goes. But
this is so weird. I mean, why not just do the old ghost box thing of, and they can communicate via electromagnetic waves somehow. Don't try to tell me they're learning this anyway. Anyway, their Ovilus repeated the words murder, dirt, dug in quick succession. Now, this is intriguing, Lee says, because the 3 dead gangsters are believed to be buried at the back of the caves. Individual evidence of paranormal activity is always strengthened if presented with information from other sources, plus technology. The problem is there's no other sources. There's just are believed.
I think one of the things that I sometimes find difficult, well, especially in cases like this where you don't have, well, I guess we haven't checked the facts yet. That's the next section. But when you don't have the documented story or whatever, it seems like it's so easy to, if you see a shadow figure bent over, it's from a gunshot. Or if these words come out of the Ovilus, or say any ghost box, or the things that repeat the words and then it or fuzzes, it goes through the radio stations and then picks the words. It's just so easy to read into that what you want. Now, if there was solid documentation that this was a thing that had happened, in my mind, that could be more of a legit story. But otherwise, can't you just say that weird ghosty things happen? I don't know because I want to believe. But I don't think that ghost hunting, I feel like we're skipping to the end of our wrap-up thoughts or something. But I think there's value in exploring and looking for spirits and ghosts and things. But I think you have to do it in a historically sound way as well.
I agree. And there's people out there who do this, and as we're going to see a little later on, Lee does this sort of thing as well a bit. And I've got to say, the book is meticulously detailed with regard to the history of these places. It's very, very good in that respect. So we do have some facts or maybe absences of facts about this case.
Yeah, so let's look at the most told, one of the most told stories about the Wabasha Street Caves, and that is the 4 gangsters being murdered in the fireside room of the Castle Royal. So first, we want to point out that in the tour video that I watched, it was referred to as the fireplace room because there is a fireplace there. But Aaron noticed that it is actually called the fireside room. So just there's a little bit of a difference there.
And I was like, your tour sucks because they got the name of the room wrong. And Sam, you had a more gracious view.
Well, yeah, I mean, first it's just, it's not you mess up when you're talking and you give a tour. You're a person, that could happen. So it could just be a flub. I flubbed many times. I'm sure I flubbed today. But also, and even when you're thinking about these tours, and I don't know that these folks give as much thought maybe as what I give into, a tour of our historic landmark house. But, you got to keep in mind what you want the visitor to walk away with. And so is calling a room the fireplace room instead of the fireside room really going to affect the overall story and the overall facts that you leave with, or is it going to bog them down with extra details? It is a room with a fireplace, so fireplace room.
Yeah, and once you explained it that way to me when we were talking, I was like, that makes sense. You frame things differently when you're on your feet with a group of people, you're moving through a space, and you're
just thinking on your toes, so it, like I said, flubs happen.
You're much more forgiving than I am about such things.
Because I do the thing. So rumor has it that the murdered men were buried deep in the caves, or, as the video mentions, in the fireside room itself, by either the killers or the police who covered it up. So the reason we can't find any corroborating stories is that the evidence of the crime was hidden by corrupt cops. But is that just convenient? Is that a way to create a story that couldn't possibly be proven or debunked? Or is that truly realistic? It's not entirely implausible. St. Paul did have a reputation as a friendly town for violent criminals for decades in the early 20th century. If you paid the right bribes to the right officials, usually at a room on the 3rd floor of St. Paul's Hotel, in the words of Paul Maccabee, author of John Dillinger Slept Here, you could kill somebody in Minneapolis, you could rob a bank in Des Moines, you could do whatever crime that you wanted, but as soon as you came to St. Paul, no one could touch you. There were also instances, Maccabee said, where the police assisted criminals in committing and covering up their actions. So, do we know exactly what happened in the fireside or fireplace room to those 3 gangsters? No, we don't. But given the context of the time, it doesn't sound like it's completely outside of the realm of possibility. Although we do want to be clear that several sources report that police records show nothing of the kind happening there. But do you believe the police records of a corrupt? I don't know.
And what did we say at the beginning when talking about Prohibition? One of the reasons why we don't have evidence of a huge surge in crime is poor record keeping by local police departments. Something else interesting is that in books like Haunted St. Paul, you have some of the same stories told on the Lost Souls tour, but some stories, unlike the ones about gangsters being gunned down, don't have any ghosts actually connected to them. And the one about gangsters being gunned down, I've only ever seen ghosts talked about in that one book by the people who did the investigation. On the ghost tour, summaries and articles, it's just like, here's a gangster thing that happened. There's also ghosts. Maybe it's connected. And you get that a lot. So there's another story in both Haunted St. Paul and Mysterious Minnesota about a young woman who danced with a stranger at the Castle Royal, and it ended up being John Dillinger. That was the whole story. They stretched that out into 3 pages.
Oh my God. Was it like all John Dillinger history? And then maybe a Johnny Depp bio too, because Johnny Depp played John Dillinger in that movie that was super boring.
Oh, he did, didn't he? Yeah, that was dull.
It was so dull.
Yeah.
I went with my sister to the theater to see it, and we were like, oh.
But there's no actual connection to paranormal activity involving Dillinger here, apart from Lee saying that this Dillinger mystery can probably never be proved or disproved unless he wanted to pay me a paranormal visit. Similarly, there's an entire section of the Wabasha Street Caves chapter dedicated to Ma Barker's gang. And the only solid connection to the caves being a thing for the Ma Barker gang is the assertion that the gang could have planned one of their criminal operations there. It's like we need to bulk this thing out with some gangster stories. So
right.
There's sort of a pattern of stories about gangsters being in a place, maybe, probably, then ghosts of gangsters decades later without solid connections between them. No names, no identities. There's gangster ghosts. Well, who were the gangsters? How did they die? Do they have a connection to this place at all? And almost as if they're claiming that there were so many gangsters here that some of them must have ended up as ghosts. It's very tenuous.
I have thoughts, but I'll wait until the end to share them. I'm not going to jump too far ahead. But are we ready for our midway break, do you think?
Next time, we're looking at some murders in Michigan.
Yes, we are.
Things are busy, folks. You're lucky you get that much of a preview. There's some murders in Michigan.
Creepy murders. Murders with creepy letters.
Yes.
But not like the Circleville letters.
No, not like the Circleville letters. No, we're not doing that again.
No. You can follow Great Lakes Lore on social media. So we are on Twitter and Instagram as Great Lakes Lore. And we also have a Facebook page where you can like and follow us there. And on any of these platforms, feel free to comment, talk at us, tweet things about us, say nice things. We like that.
I was going to say, don't open that up. Tweet things about us.
You can also support us on Patreon. If that's something you're interested in doing, you can visit patreon.com/ChizoMedia. It is a Patreon for both Great Lakes Lore and Aaron's other podcast, The Saucer Life. And there we have bonus content, early access to episode, blog posts, and we share some field trips sometimes as well. So there's lots of fun bonus stuff available at 2 different tier levels.
So now it's time for our... well, we call it the book segment. We don't have a better name for it yet. I don't think we need one. I think book segment
that's fine.
Is fine.
Yeah.
Sam, what have you been reading?
I am still reading Ghostland by Colin Dickey, and I am sort of cruising through that. I'm also skipping around a little bit because each of the chapters are kind of independent of each other, looking at these different historic places that are supposedly haunted. And it's actually, I'm liking it more at this point than I was last week. He takes a really interesting perspective on the hauntings, and he really tries to find like the source of the haunting. So kind of some stuff we do. There's an interesting chapter about the Winchester house, and he is able, like, he shares Sarah Winchester's story, perspectives on why it was that she kept building the house, and actually tracks down kind of the source of the rumors that, you know, she was doing it to appease the ghosts of all those killed by the Winchester rifle, and that she was some mad lunatic woman or whatever. And so he totally debunks that. And that was some really cool history work, I thought. So I enjoyed that. Although he did make this weird comment about there being a Thomas Jefferson ghost at Monticello. And frankly, if anybody knew that there was a Thomas Jefferson ghost at Monticello, I feel like it would be me.
Without question.
Unless, you know, like I mentioned on Twitter, I feel like the Thomas Jefferson Foundation probably keeps a very firm grasp on what docents are allowed to say. So maybe they regularly see TJ roaming the halls, but they're under strict orders not to say anything. That's the only way that there's a ghost at Monticello.
That makes sense. So I read, I read it in, 2 nights. Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology that you read that you read previously, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's fun.
I'm not a huge mythology guy. I get confused with all the names. I'll be honest. I don't know. It just doesn't stick. But I love the stories. I just can't keep it all straight in my head and find it a little frustrating sometimes. But I really liked this. And what was interesting, or one of the things I found the most interesting, was that I was really surprised at the number of stories I remembered from somewhere. I must, as a kid, I think every kid who all of us bookie kids, probably ended up reading mythology books at some time because I
never read
fun.
any Norse ones, but I was really into the Greek gods, so I was all about that. And Egyptian. I liked Egyptian history too.
I sort of remember a book when I was a kid that had some Norse mythology and like some Russian stuff and like some just sort of weird Northern European, Central Asia sort of things. And there are some stories that I remember. The one about the challenges, like Thor's challenges or the gods' challenges, where Thor's drinking from the drinking horn and he can't finish it off. It's only down like an inch, and we thought you could drink more than that, Thor. It turns out no, you were actually draining the oceans. You're the most powerful creature, in Asgard or Midgard or Norn stones or whatever. I don't know. I get confused with all the terms. But that one and one I remember that one from a kid. But the one I didn't remember was there was a wedding and I think Loki had a rope wrapped around his junk and it was being tugged on by a donkey, something like that. I might not be remembering the details exactly, but
that's about that.
I think that was it. I think that was. Yeah, that was fun. You wince a little bit, but it's fun. Right? So I enjoyed that greatly, and it was a quick read, and fun. I like Neil Gaiman anyway, so it was good.
Yeah, I liked the way that he was able to tell these stories as individual stories, but still keep this larger narrative that was also building. Like you could go into the middle of that book, just read a story and great, fine. You got it. But yeah, if you read it in order, you see how this narrative, the sagas of Norse mythology play out and build all the way to Ragnarok. And I think he held that storyline subtly, but held it, and it's just so good. it was I was gonna say it was structurally very sound, which sounds like the most damning with faint praise thing ever, right? It's like, what do you think of this book? Structurally sound, at a beginning, a middle, and an end. Can't ask for more than that. But no, I agree. I thought it held together, it hung together as a narrative, and you could feel it building. I mean, once you get to the point where Loki has the weird kids.
Yes,
that's
Loki's kids and the brother who kills his brother, the blind brother who kills his brother.
Yeah, that was closer to the end though. Loki's weird kids was earlier.
Yeah, so that's true.
And the trolls who made the gifts, right?
Yes.
Like, or were they dwarves? The dwarves who made the gifts. That was another one where you're like, this will be important later on.
Yes. Yeah, and it just, you can see all these little things being planted, and then you get to Ragnarok, and I'm a Ragnarok fan from way back. Just the concept of the Gotterdammerung, sort of this Twilight of the Gods sort of thing is a fun concept. But I'm glad I read it, and thank you so much for
I'm glad you liked it too.
Yeah, I'm glad I already owned it. Yeah.
All right, well, let's get back to the show. All right, so now we are going to move on and talk about Schmidt's Brewery, which is also in St. Paul. And Adrian Lee also talks about this in his book, and his little epigraph for this chapter is a bit clever, a bit more clever than what he had for the previous stop. He wrote, "Kidnapping, gangland activities, and industrial accidents mean the only thing now brewing in this disused factory is paranormal activity." Brewing. So let's start with the basic history of the building. So what would become the Schmidt Brewery was established in 1855 as the Cave Brewery. So yes, we get caves again. In this case, the cool caves allowed for the proper cold fermentation storage of German-style lagers. It became the Stallman Brewery in 1879, with Jacob Schmidt and his family taking over in 1901, incorporated as the Jacob Schmidt Brewing Company. Schmidt had been in the brewing industry for decades and actually retired from running day-to-day operations a couple years before, leaving his daughter Anna and his son-in-law Adolf Bremer in charge of the company. As for ghost stories, Lee's book details a number of incidents from their investigation of the recently abandoned Schmidt Brewery building. The most compelling is the case of Matthew Kohler. As the investigators moved through the brewery, Tim, who seems to be their resident psychic, noticed a man in front of them who would not communicate except to psychically explain that he was a fireman.
How would that work? I mean, what mess? I am a fireman. I am a fireman. I am a fireman. I guess. I don't know. So Lee assumed that this meant firefighter, which I think we mostly would. We hear fireman, we think,
that's what I would assume.
it's a gendered term for firefighter.
Yep.
But later, doing archival research, he found a story from 1904 of Matthew Kohler, whose job at the brewery was to stoke fires and keep the oil lamps lit, a job that had the title of fireman. According to the April 16th, 1904 issue of the St. Paul Daily Globe, Kohler was filling an oil lamp and some of the oil spilled on his clothes. He was engulfed in flames. He inhaled them. He was rushed to the hospital, but was burned badly over his entire body. The burns were fatal. He was 37, was married with 6 kids. Now, Lee argues that this was obviously the being that his team had encountered in the brewery. Tragic death, horrifying death, figure saying fireman. He believes that if he hears a name during an investigation, it's only a matter of time until his research confirms the identity of the person. Now, this seems to me a bit optimistic, but the most interesting part of the story is something that happened several years later in 2016. Lee was investigating a haunting in Iowa when he encountered a familiar entity. Now, he turned on his ghost box and he heard something, and he lays this all out. So, Sam, I think what we're going to do is...
Yes, I'm fine with that.
We're going to dramatize this. Okay. I brought this up to her before, folks, and she was non-committal about the reenactment, but
I wanted to see how I was feeling in the moment.
Okay. I'm glad we have a firm commitment. We would have hired people to do this, but so who do you want to be? Do you want to be the ghost hunter or the ghost?
I'll be the ghost hunter.
Okay. So you go first then.
Yes, I know. Who is here?
Matthew.
Do you prefer Matthew or Matt?
Matthew.
Did you work here?
No.
Did you live here?
No.
Did you come from the surrounding area?
No.
So where are you from?
St. Paul.
Have we met before?
Yes.
Where from?
Brewery.
Are you Matthew Kohler?
Yes.
Do you remember talking to me?
Yes.
Why have you come through? Do you have a message for me?
Hello.
Hello. It's good to talk to you again. I found who you were. I documented your life and passing in the book Mysterious Minnesota.
Thank you.
Do you have anything you wish to tell me?
Just thank you.
So why is the ghost in Iowa now? Lee doesn't have an explanation, except to say that ghosts are not bound by geography, which I'm very excited about because this means that I can attempt to contact Thomas Jefferson right here in mid-Michigan.
You don't even have to go to Monticello.
No.
You don't have to mess with the foundation?
Nope.
And their cover-up of the ghost truth of Thomas Jefferson? Yeah.
I hope nobody from there listens to this because then they'll never hire me.
Oh, no.
So there are also a couple of user-submitted ghost stories at the Haunted Places website. The brewery was converted to loft apartments with people moving in around 2013 or 2014, and the accounts at the website are vague. Lights turning on and off, shadowy beings, that kind of thing. No one identifying themselves as a brewery fireman or anything like that, though. Numerous articles on Haunted Minneapolis, as well as the Adrian Lee book, mention that Edward G. Bremer, the son of the owners, was kidnapped by the Ma Barker gang in 1934, but this is merely described as an example of sinister or spooky history with no actual ghosts mentioned. So we have another case, just like we do with the Wabasha caves, where they've made the connection to like some kind of cool gangster history, like they're attempting to do, but it doesn't actually tie into ghosts.
No, and you don't even get there's a lot of negative energy because of kidnapping that might have, stuck to the vats in the brewery or something. You don't even get that attempt at a link.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I'll say, it's sort of connected to that I forgot to put in the outline, is that a lot of these haunted Twin Cities stories talk about Matthew Kohler's death, but they never talk about the fact that he was seen as a ghost. And I think it's because it's just in this book, because it's this guy's investigation.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't, without sort of seeming to promote somebody's book in their article for free, they just say, a lot of crazy things happen in this brewery. So checking the facts, Matthew Kohler's death was reported in contemporary news reports as described in Lee's book. In fact, even where we might question his ghost hunting techniques or conclusions, we have to acknowledge that Lee has degrees in history and does very thorough research on the locations of these hauntings, and the write-ups in the book are accompanied by extensive newspaper excerpts with actual citations of the newspaper, the date, and the page.
That's fantastic.
It's miraculous. It's unprecedented in some of these types of books.
Yeah.
Now, for me, the issue, if it is an issue, is that the entire story hinges on Lee's investigation. Like I said, it would be recounted in much less detail and website articles, but without, sort of that firm connection between Kohler's death and a ghost. But there aren't decades of tales of the ghost of Matthew Kohler haunting the brewery. You would think if he was haunting this brewery from 1904 until the 1980s, when the brewery closed, there would be, the ghost of old man Kohler and his burned corpse is, up on the mezzanine or something. You don't get that. But much like Tales of Gangsters, Kohler's death was sensational and attention grabbing. So let's link that to a ghost story. Of course, it's pretty horrific, like most industrial accidents are. Stories like that tend to have tales grow up around them one way or another. But I think for me, the biggest issue is that this is, Lee's book is sort of the account of Kohler haunting the place. And the showing up in Iowa thing is just
super weird.
Super weird. Yeah.
All right, so we wanted to wrap up by considering a few questions that Aaron and I both kind of came up with and have been thinking about. And I think one of the biggest ones has to deal with the historical context of these ghosts. So why is it that Prohibition and Gangsters have this hold on us? Why do we want John Dillinger to have slept here? Why is it so fun to have, people dressed up as gangsters at your wedding reception to show you wedding reception to show you the caves where they had the speakeasy?
I was going to say, and this sounds really facetious, I was going to say, I think it's the sharp suits.
I think the style, the fashion has a big, the Roaring Twenties overall are popular because it has a very iconic and glamorous fashion about it. I would 100% agree with that.
Everything from the clothes to Art Deco architecture. And it's got a look, which means sort of calling back to one of our pet peeves of things being referred to as old timey.
Yes.
20s ghosts, I don't think would ever be referred to as old timey because it's iconically recognizable.
Yeah.
So nobody's going to say there's like some guy in a suit. No, it's like a gangster suit.
Right. It's the boxy suit, the really wide leg pants, the fedora. And kind of a sticking it to the man kind of story too. Like, well, if the government's going to outlaw our alcohol, then we're going to go to the speakeasy where the mob's running business. Like, we're going to find our workaround. And
the mobs supplying the alcohol are sort of just almost like Robin Hood.
Right.
Figures,
yes. Yes.
Bringing whiskey to the wealthy who are going to these speakeasies in a lot of cases.
Well, and it's all very defined. Like, Prohibition has a definite start and an end date. There's a definite style that goes along with it. And so I think when you're one of these places that existed long before Prohibition and long after Prohibition, that 1920 to 1933 period is something that people will flock to hear about, and you can take this little snapshot in history and sort of woo them with it, you know?
Yeah, it's very marketable. It's a very marketable.
I threw a Gatsby party. Like 2 of them. So I mean, I've done the same thing at work with the Gatsby parties. I mean, we weren't celebrating organized crime there, but you know, I mean,
weren't you really?
Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. So, spooky history. That phrase comes up a lot. Why does spooky, Sam, do you think get used as a synonym for violent or horrific industrial accident?
I think it's because based on pop culture, things that I don't know if know is the right word, but things we've been primed to accept is that where bad things happen, there are ghosts, right? Like, right. It is the tortured souls of the folks who are, you know, killed in the accident, murdered, whatever, that are going to be haunting a place. I think are brought that far more frequently than this person loved the house so much they just never wanted to leave.
They died peacefully in bed and hung around giving sage advice to everybody afterward. Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes sense. I think we've created sort of a narrative or sort of origin story for what ghosts and hauntings are that is connected to traumatic stuff.
Pain equals ghost.
Because we know so much scientifically about how ghosts work, right? And what causes hauntings, right? So back in the fall, we had an episode where we talked about the concept of dark tourism. So how do you think dark tourism bleeds into or overlaps with ghost tourism or haunting tours and things like that?
Yeah, so I think the thing to remember, and that we mentioned there, was the difference between like ghost tourism or haunted tourism and dark tourism. That there are a lot of folks in the field who look at dark tourism more as, you know, visiting places where bad things happen, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily hunting for ghosts, right? Like you're not trying to find the paranormal there. So I think that's an important distinction to make. And so sites where bad things happened, you know, where there was an industrial accident or whatever, they can be a site for dark tourism. And I think it can be done well. I think it can be done in a way where you learn about the event historically, you put it into context, you learn about the people who were affected, how it changed the area long into the future, you know, whatever it could be. But when you sort of cheesify it, you're doing a serious disservice to the people who endured whatever that tragedy was, I think. And so ghost tourism also, I think, can be done in good and bad ways as well. And taking a ghost tour of a place, I think, can do a lot to share history to folks who might not be interested in history or think they're interested in history. But again, I think you just have to focus on the fact that you're still sharing the history of a place. You're not here as some kind of, you know, haunted attraction, say, that's, you know, built up in October that everybody dresses up for to scare people off. And that's what really turned me off with the tours of the caves was, you know, the dressed up guides. They totally made it super cheesy. Now, I took a haunted pirate tour of Charleston and the guide was, yes, dressed up like a pirate. It was fun. That didn't seem as problematic to me because, and you know, she wasn't playing a role. She wasn't faking an accent like this woman was. I mean, this person had a whole different name and gory, weird backstory. You know, you're in Charleston, South Carolina. You're taking a tour with a lady dressed up as a pirate.
Right. As opposed to being in St. Paul with a French maid with a noose around her neck.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Somewhere online, I think it was Twitter, because that's where all the worst stuff is a lot of times. I saw somebody say something along the lines of that when it comes to historic hauntings, we should avoid debunking and instead just appreciate the reality that the telling of stories has created. That makes me want to, really, the stories make everything real. It's like, no, they don't. They're important. Stories are desperately important. And, you know, they have a reality of themselves, but it doesn't make other things real. And it just did, like, forget about these historic places. Forget what the facts are. The stories are what matter. I was like, no, I angrily disagree with that. Are you more sympathetic to that view?
A smidge, but only because I think it all depends on what the goals are. If you are attempting to give a history of a place, if you are, trying to do something factual, then that is very important. And personally, I think that, tales of hauntings, when connected with factual history, are the most powerful. But I also think that if you are trying to look at maybe the legends that have surrounded a place and maybe study why it has attracted legends. So, like, why has the Wabasha Street Caves been sort of this focal point of ghostly activity in St. Paul, then looking at stories that maybe are not credible, but like, why do people feel compelled to tell them? What does the story do for the reputation of the place? I think there's a place for the less than factual stories, but it's got to be done right, and it has to be done in a way that from the outset that you're hearing something that is not necessarily true. On house tours, we have stories about the house I lead tours of that are not. I cannot verify them anywhere. It's sort of like, well, we heard from, right, a family member who told a family member who told a family member. And so for a while, these stories were just shared. But when I started there, I said that, if I can't prove it, I'm going to share it in a way that is clear to people that I've heard,
right.
The local legend says, like, sure, that's cheesy, but that's a way to say that you don't have the evidence to corroborate the story. And so there are ways to qualify the story that you're telling so that people don't take it as fact.
I agree. Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. What sort of left me sort of cold with some of this stuff is local legend says, or it is believed.
Is the only thing.
Right. They're the only things, except for the fireman. I like the fireman story because you can trace that to an actual person. Mm-hmm. But even the local legends, are they local legends, or are they legends that have emerged since the ghost tourism?
Right. So that's what one of the points I wanted to make is that, I chose these two sites when we were planning this episode because they popped up on several lists of haunted places in Minnesota. And once we started looking at them, Aaron and I were both like, these places are kind of lame. Like, these are not great haunting stories. There's little evidence of things, and like, you can't even find that much about them online outside of a few news articles and the website for the venue itself or whatever. And it feels very much to me like when ghost tours became popular, someone was like, oh, St. Paul needs some ghost stuff. And,
right.
And we've got this Prohibition connection, and let's look at some old places that were functioning and have a Prohibition like history, and like, let's make that the thing. And that's how all of this feels very much to me.
That's you said that better than I could. That's what I was sort of, but it reminds me, I'm not telling you to go back to the archives and listen, but if you haven't, you should go listen to our Nain Rouge episode, because a lot of this reminds me of the Nain Rouge was seen in the 1967 Detroit riots story, which has, John Tenney is still looking for that article, but it's like the only source for it is people saying that this is a story. You'd never get to the sighting itself.
Right.
And it was just 1967. So, they could still be alive. But yeah, a lot of this seems very thin.
Yes. The other thing that really frustrates me, particularly with the Wabasha street caves, is that it's a place that has an amazing history to it.
Yes.
And it's just being pimped out.
Yeah.
That is totally how it feels. Like, I could take that story, I could create an amazing interpretive plan and lead incredible history tours, maybe make a few ghost jokes throughout it if needed, but like, the story is so rich on its own. I don't understand why. I don't know.
Gangsters are money. So
but you could still do a history tour of gangsters.
You could, but I think a lot of the gangster stuff has been exaggerated with it.
It's like, sure.
And so that's, you got to keep it vague, and then you can't really do a history tour if all you've got is local legend says that a girl danced with John Dillinger here. So that's, I think I don't know.
I could craft the hell out of that tour,
Sam,
man.
I know you could. I have every confidence in your abilities to do that. You know what else I think you could do a really good job with? A mushroom tour of the caves. I think you could take your experience in sort of the horticultural side of these things, and you could explain fungus to people.
There you go. Yeah.
Fungiculture? Is that what we call it?
I think so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. What do you think?
I think so.
All right. Well, thank you for listening.
Gangster Ghosts of St. Paul was written and produced by Aaron Gullius and Samantha Engel.
Our music is by Raphael Crux.
Great Lakes Lore is a Chizo Media production. Chizo Media, our heart is with the people.
Until next time, don't get lost in the lore.